There are some nights that begin, like every other night, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet by morning everything has changed forever. On June 5th, 1986, in a modest home in South Carolina, 4-year-old Jessica Gutierrez went to sleep surrounded by her family, unaware that this would be the last night she would ever spend in her own bed. Jessica was the youngest of 4 children, the baby of the family, playful, energetic, and deeply attached to her mother, Debbie, who was raising the children largely on her own after a difficult divorce. Life was not easy for Debbie, balancing work and motherhood, stretching every dollar to provide for her children, but despite the financial pressure, the home was filled with warmth and the kind of closeness that only families who struggle together truly understand. Yet that summer evening had been completely normal. The children played outside while Debbie finished chores around the house. They ate dinner together, talked about small things, laughed, and eventually prepared for bed. Jessica usually slept beside her mother, but that particular night her brother was suffering from an earache and needed comfort, so Debbie allowed him to sleep in her bed instead. Jessica went to sleep in the room she shared with her sisters. It was a simple decision, one no parent would think twice about, yet it would become the detail Debbie would replay in her mind for decades. The next morning, Debbie woke up around 9 o'clock and immediately felt that something was wrong. The front door, which she always locked before going to bed, was wide open. Their dog, normally kept outside, was roaming inside the house. As near the back window, the protective screen had been removed and a curtain rod lay on the ground. A wave of dread washed over her as she rushed toward the girl's bedroom. Jessica was gone. At first, Debbie convinced herself that her daughter might be hiding or playing outside, but as she searched every corner of the house and yard, panic quickly replaced denial. When she asked her 6-year-old daughter, Rebecca, where Jessica was, Rebecca calmly replied with words that would haunt the case for years. "A man with a beard and a magic hat took her." Debbie initially thought her daughter was imagining things, perhaps confusing a dream with reality. But as the questioning continued, Rebecca described waking up in the middle of the night and seeing a bearded man wearing a tall hat standing beside the bed. He unplugged the fan and nightlight and gently lifted Jessica while she was still asleep and carried her out of the room. Rebecca said she was too frightened to scream and hid under the blanket, convincing herself it must have been a dream. Police responded immediately and treated the scene as a suspected abduction. Investigators determined that the intruder likely entered through the living room window after removing the protective screen. Outside the window, they discovered a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts. On the exterior glass, they found a fingerprint that appeared fresh. Officers canvassed the surrounding fields, forests, streams, and abandoned structures. The FBI joined the search. Flyers were distributed across the state, and even aircraft surveyed the rural land from above. Despite the massive effort, there was no sign of Jessica. And days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Debbie grew increasingly frustrated with what she believed was a lack of urgency from local authorities. She saved recordings of tense conversations with the sheriff, convinced that her daughter's case was not receiving the attention it deserved. 10 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, a breakthrough appeared to emerge from an unexpected place. A 27-year-old man named Thomas McDowell was arrested for a violent break-in in another state. When his fingerprints were entered into the system, investigators received a full match to the fingerprint found on Jessica's window. Debbie immediately recognized the name. Months before the abduction, she had hired McDowell to perform repair work on her property. He had spent 2 days at her house building a shed and fixing the porch, and she remembered that he had a beard and frequently wore a tall cowboy hat. Investigators began considering whether Rebecca's description of a wizard hat could have been a child's interpretation of a cowboy hat seen briefly in the dark. However, despite the fingerprint match, prosecutors hesitated. Because McDowell had previously worked on the property, they argued that the fingerprint could have been left earlier, unrelated to the abduction. Debbie strongly disputed this, explaining that she regularly cleaned that window and that the children frequently leaned against it with dirty hands, making it highly unlikely that an old fingerprint would remain untouched for months. In 1987, another disturbing development surfaced. McDowell's prison cellmate contacted authorities claiming that McDowell had confessed to abducting a young girl from her bedroom in South Carolina. According to the cellmate, McDowell admitted assaulting the child and killing her in a fit of rage before disposing of her remains in a field. When confronted, McDowell did not deny the confession but demanded full immunity in exchange for formally admitting guilt. Authorities refused, unwilling to grant immunity without a body or additional corroborating evidence. Once again, the case stalled. Years passed. Jessica's disappearance became one of South Carolina's most painful cold cases. Debbie continued to speak publicly, accusing officials of ignoring critical evidence. Age-progressed images were created in hopes that someone might recognize Jessica as she would have appeared as a teenager, while every potential lead ended in disappointment. In 2021, 35 years after Jessica vanished, a newly appointed sheriff reopened the investigation with support from the FBI. 50 agents were assigned to re-examine every piece of evidence. They revisited the fingerprint analysis, the cigarette brand found outside the window, and the testimony of McDowell's former cellmate. Relatives and acquaintances of McDowell revealed that shortly after Jessica disappeared, he abruptly shaved his beard, cut his long hair, and stopped wearing his cowboy hat entirely. They also confirmed that he smoked the same brand of cigarettes discovered near the Gutierrez home. Although no new DNA could be extracted from the aging evidence, investigators believe the totality of circumstances was finally strong enough to move forward. In January 2022, at 62 years old, Thomas McDowell was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. He maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. The trial began in early 2024, nearly 4 decades after the crime. The defense attempted to undermine the fingerprint evidence and argued that Rebecca could not have mistaken a cowboy hat for a wizard's hat. Prosecutors countered that the fingerprint's condition indicated it was recent at the time of discovery, and that McDowell's prison confession contained details not publicly known. The former cellmate testified in court, repeating the chilling account of McDowell's admission. On February 8, 2024, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Thomas McDowell was sentenced to life in prison. For Debbie, the verdict brought a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow, and she had believed for decades that he was responsible. Yet the conviction did not bring back her daughter, nor did it reveal the location of Jessica's remains. After nearly 40 years, justice had finally been delivered, but closure remained painfully incomplete. Jessica's body was never found, and her family continues to hope that one day the final piece of truth will surface. Cold cases often remind us that time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes it preserves it, waiting quietly until someone is willing to look again. In Jessica's case, it took 35 years for the silence to break, proving that even when justice is delayed, it is never entirely out of reach.